In 1910 Louisiana, on a sweltering night thick with cypress air and river shadows, a daughter of the famed Voodoo Queen was forced into a marriage unlike any other. Her groom already lay cold in his tomb. Before we begin, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments below. In the year 1910, Louisiana lay heavy beneath the late summer heat. The air over the bayous clung thick to the skin, damp with the scent of cypress and slow-moving water. In New Orleans, the city pulsed with music and commerce, its streets a patchwork of horse-drawn carriages, market cries, and the distant hum of riverboats. Behind the facades of brick townhouses and wooden cottages, lives were governed by tradition, reputation, and debts, both spoken and unspoken. Among the neighborhoods that sprawled along the edges of Congo Square, there were whispers of a woman whose family name carried weight. She was known as the daughter of the Voodoo Queen, and though the famed matriarch had long since passed, her shadow remained. Some sought the daughter's counsel with reverence, believing she inherited her mother's strength. Others approached with caution, wary of old associations and debts owed across generations. Her life was not lived in isolation. She bore the same struggles as others in the city, neighbors who demanded payment, creditors who pressed hard, and kin who depended on her. Yet, unlike most, her lineage ensured that her troubles were never purely her own. Every coin owed seemed heavier, every bargain sharpened. And in 1910, one debt in particular rose to dominate her days, demanding settlement in a way that defied ordinary resolution. It began not with ceremony or spectacle, but with a simple knock on her door late one evening. Outside, the lamps along the street flickered in the moist wind, shadows curling along the walls. The visitor carried neither joy nor pity, only obligation, a reminder that debts, once called in, could not be ignored. The city itself seemed to conspire in silence. The Mississippi rolled dark and restless, its waters swollen with unseen currents. The cemeteries, with their marble tombs lifted high above ground, kept their solemn watch, reminders of how life and death intertwined in Louisiana's soil. And within this place, at this moment, the daughter found herself pressed toward a choice that would mark her name as indelibly as her mother's. The arrangement that followed would become spoken of only in fragments, carried in half-remembered whispers. It was not simply a marriage, nor merely a transaction. It was an act meant to settle a balance, one that required her to take the hand of a groom who could not stand, nor speak, nor breathe. The story of how she came to this bargain stretched backward through years of circumstance, misfortune, and obligations inherited. To understand the moment when she stood at the threshold of that fateful marriage, one had to understand the web of debts that clung to her family's name. Her mother's reputation had been vast, reaching far beyond the boundaries of New Orleans. The Voodoo Queen was sought out by the desperate, the curious, and the powerful alike. Some came with offerings of coin, jewels, or favors. Others left promises, sealed not by ink and paper, but by spoken word and unyielding expectation. When her mother died, many of those promises did not die with her. They drifted forward in time, attaching themselves to the daughter, who bore the double weight of legacy and liability. She had lived with this inheritance from her earliest days. The houses she passed each morning, the markets where she purchased food, the gatherings in backyards and courtyards, all were filled with faces that remembered what had been granted or denied by her mother. Some smiled in kindness, others withheld their gaze, bitter over fortunes they believed had turned against them. In such a world, every step she took was watched, weighed, and measured. By 1910, the economy of Louisiana was still fragile. Cotton and sugar remained staples, yet the industries fluctuated, leaving many struggling to survive. The aftermath of Reconstruction, Jim Crow laws, and the shifting tide of immigration left the city's communities under constant strain. For women, especially those tied to families with controversial legacies, opportunities were scarce. She could sew, she could cook, she could mend, and she could counsel those who sought her out, but money flowed like water. Here for a moment, gone the next. It was in this atmosphere that a creditor approached. He was a man who claimed his father had once provided great sums to her mother, expecting repayment that never came. Time had dulled nothing in his view. Debts could survive across generations just as bloodlines did. He demanded recompense, and when coin could not satisfy him, he pressed for something more unusual. In Louisiana, the rituals surrounding death carried enormous weight. Families purchased tombs that could hold entire lineages. The cemeteries, built above ground to avoid the flooding of the delta soil, became cities of the dead, their whitewashed walls and ornate carvings standing as monuments to memory and wealth. Among these tombs, arrangements were often made, some legal, some spoken in private, to bind one family to another even after life had ended. The creditor's demand came in this form. His kin, he said, had lost a son too young. The boy had been promised a union, one that was meant to elevate the family's standing. His death had disrupted that plan, leaving both honor and ambition unresolved. And so he demanded that she, the daughter of the Voodoo Queen, step into that place. She would marry the dead son in ceremony, sealing not only the broken promise, but also the ledger of debt he claimed remained open. The proposition was shocking in its strangeness, yet not entirely unheard of. Throughout history, in scattered places, marriages between the living and the deceased had been performed, often for reasons of inheritance, legitimacy, or honor. In France, the practice of mariage posthume was recognized under law in certain cases. In Louisiana, where French and Catholic traditions mingled with African and Caribbean practices, echoes of such customs were not impossible to imagine. For her, however, the matter was not merely ceremonial. It was survival. If she refused, she risked more than scorn. The creditor's reach extended into courts, into markets, into the neighborhoods where whispers could turn neighbors into enemies overnight. Refusal could mean eviction, ruin, or worse. The days leading to the ceremony unfolded with heavy silence. She walked through her routines as if through water, each motion slowed by the knowledge of what lay ahead. In the market, she heard fragments of gossip already stirring. Some said she had found a wealthy suitor. Others claimed she had been coerced. Few could imagine the truth, and fewer still would believe it if told plainly. At night, she sat by a small lamp, the shadows swaying on the walls. She considered her mother's legacy, the weight of her name, and the eyes of the city upon her. She considered what it meant to enter into vows with someone who could neither consent nor object, who had already been carried to rest. She wondered whether the ceremony would free her or bind her more tightly than ever before. The day of the marriage was set. It would not be held in a church, for no priest would sanction such a union. Instead, it would take place within the cemetery itself, among the tombs and mausoleums that stood like stone guardians over generations of lives ended. The participants would be few, the creditor's family, a notary willing to witness without question, and herself. When the morning arrived, the sky hung low with clouds. The streets of New Orleans carried on as usual, Children played, vendors shouted, horses clattered over cobblestones, but her path led elsewhere. She walked toward the gates of the cemetery, her steps echoing against the quiet stones. The air smelled of earth, stone, and the faint sweetness of wilted flowers left on graves. Each tomb rose before her like a chapter in a book of silence. Names carved in marble spoke of centuries past, of families who once held power, wealth, and sorrow. The ground beneath her seemed to hum with the collective memory of the city, pressing upon her with the weight of countless stories. At the appointed tomb, the family of the deceased son awaited. Their expressions held no warmth, only formality. The notary prepared his documents, his pen poised. And there, before the stone chamber where her groom had been laid, she stood ready to speak vows that would never be answered, to sign her name beside one already etched in death. The union would not bring her joy, nor companionship. It would bring closure to a debt that had stretched across decades. Yet in the act of binding herself to the dead, she crossed a threshold that few in her time could comprehend. The weight of the choice settled on her shoulders as the ritual began, and in that moment, the daughter of the Voodoo Queen became bound to a story that would outlast the whispers of her neighbors and the gaze of her creditors. The ceremony had begun. The cemetery stood still around her as the ceremony advanced. The sun pressed through shifting clouds, striking the marble tombs in muted flashes. The officiant's voice, though subdued, carried with precision across the quiet rows of stone. No organ played, no bells rang, and no congregation filled the aisles. Instead, there were only a handful of witnesses: the creditor, his family, the notary, and a pair of attendants who lingered at a distance, uncertain whether to watch or to avert their eyes. Her gown was not white but plain, a garment she already owned, repurposed for this occasion. To spend money on silk or lace would have mocked the necessity that brought her here. The simplicity of her attire contrasted sharply with the solemnity of the moment. Though there was no living groom beside her, a space had been arranged at her side, a symbolic presence, marked by a folded garment of the deceased son and the tomb that held him. The notary unrolled a parchment, its ink already prepared. His task was not to bless, but to legalize, to transform this moment into something that could be recorded and recognized. Louisiana law did not explicitly sanction such unions, yet loopholes and precedent allowed contracts to be drafted in ways that satisfied the letter of custom, if not the spirit. What mattered most was that the creditor and his kin could point to a witnessed union, a binding acknowledgment that their son's promised marriage had been fulfilled. For her, the moment unfolded with a mixture of clarity and distance. Each word spoken felt both immediate and far away, as though she stood within herself and apart at once. She repeated the necessary responses when prompted, her voice carrying into the still air. The witnesses looked on, some with curiosity, some with unease, and others with the cold detachment of those attending to business rather than ceremony. At the point where rings might have been exchanged, there was instead a gesture toward the tomb. A small token, a band of metal that had belonged to the deceased, was pressed into her hand. She held it, then placed it into a niche prepared in the tomb wall, as if returning it to its original owner. The act was symbolic, meant to complete a cycle rather than begin one. The notary recorded her name beside that of the deceased, writing carefully to avoid error. His quill scratched softly against the page, a sound that seemed louder than the murmurs of the officiant. When he finished, he raised the paper for the witnesses to see, then signed his own hand at the bottom. The creditor followed, his expression taut with satisfaction rather than joy. No celebration followed. There was no feast, no music, no procession through the streets. Instead, the family of the deceased offered her a curt nod, as if she had fulfilled an obligation long overdue. The notary packed away his materials, the officiant closed his book, and the attendants drifted away. Within minutes, the small cluster dispersed, leaving her alone before the tomb. She stood in silence, the weight of the moment pressing upon her. Around her, the cemetery seemed vast, its rows of stones stretching endlessly. Each tomb represented stories of lives, families, and legacies. But in that moment, hers felt set apart, defined by a choice that blurred the boundary between custom and necessity. When she finally stepped away, the air felt heavier. Her debt, in the eyes of the creditor, had been settled. Yet the nature of the settlement left her tethered to a memory she had not chosen, bound to a man she had never spoken to, and recorded in documents that would outlast her lifetime. As she left the cemetery gates, the city beyond greeted her with its ordinary sounds: the clatter of hooves on cobblestones, the cry of vendors, the music drifting faintly from a distant courtyard. Life carried on as though nothing remarkable had occurred, yet she carried within her the knowledge of what had transpired. The union was complete, but its consequences, whispered, judged, and interpreted by those around her, were only beginning. The days following the cemetery ceremony unfolded with an uncanny quiet. There was no announcement in the newspapers, no listing in the parish bulletins, no public notice that might draw attention to the unusual union. Yet New Orleans was a city where news traveled without paper. Markets, corner stoops, and back-alley courtyards became places where stories spread faster than the Mississippi current, and within a week, whispers had reached the ears of those who made it their business to know. At first, the tale was vague. Some said she had entered into marriage, though none could name the groom. Others hinted at a private arrangement with a family of influence. Then more curious accounts emerged, murmurs that she had been wed not to the living, but to the dead. The gossip drifted through neighborhoods like incense smoke, curling into every corner, changing shape with each retelling. In Tremé, the community closest to her family's past, the story struck with particular weight. Elders remembered her mother's influence, the alliances she had formed, and the debts left unresolved. To some, the daughter's marriage seemed a continuation of that legacy, proof that obligations could not be avoided even after death. To others, it was a scandal, a humiliation that revealed weakness where once there had been strength. Beyond Tremé, in the French Quarter and the Garden District, the whispers took on a different tone. There, among the wealthier classes, the union was recounted with a blend of fascination and disdain. The very strangeness of it made it a subject for parlors and dinner tables, where guests could murmur about those people who still clung to practices incomprehensible to polite society. The daughter herself moved through this storm with a kind of guarded composure. She kept to her routines, visiting markets, tending to her small household, offering guidance to those who sought her counsel, but she could feel the weight of eyes upon her wherever she went. Children sometimes fell silent when she passed. Neighbors offered greetings laced with curiosity rather than warmth. Even among those who sympathized, there was hesitation, as though her new status placed her at a remove from ordinary life. The creditor, for his part, was satisfied. He declared the debt settled, withdrawing his claims with the certainty of a man who had forced the world to bend to his will. His family spoke of their son as though he had finally received his due, his honor restored through the marriage. To them, the act was less about the woman herself and more about the restoration of their standing, a symbolic correction to the imbalance of fate. But documents, once signed, have a way of living beyond the moment. The notary's record of the marriage was placed among his files, a quiet piece of parchment bearing her name alongside the deceased's. Though no priest had sanctified it, though no congregation had witnessed it, the paper remained as proof, ready to be unearthed whenever questions arose. In a city where property, inheritance, and reputation often collided in the courts, such a record could not be dismissed as mere rumor. Meanwhile, the daughter found herself caught between two worlds. On one side lay her obligation, fulfilled, finalized, and no longer hanging over her like a storm cloud. On the other lay her reputation, altered in ways she could neither control nor undo. A woman tied to the dead could not easily attract suitors, nor move freely among the networks of families whose approval shaped opportunities. And yet, there were those who admired her resolve. Among certain circles, especially those who valued strength in the face of coercion, her actions were seen as an act of survival, a defiance against ruin. She had endured what others might not have, submitting to the unthinkable in order to protect her household and maintain her independence. In their eyes, she carried not shame but resilience, though such praise was often spoken in private rather than proclaimed aloud. The city, restless and layered, continued to hum around her. Brass bands paraded through the streets on Sundays, their notes lifting into the air. Streetcars rattled along St. Charles Avenue. Dockworkers labored along the riverfront, their voices echoing against the warehouses. Life did not pause for her story, yet it was woven into the fabric of these days, a thread of rumor that would not unravel. What she did not yet know was how far the consequences of her marriage would reach. For while debts may be settled on paper, the social currency of a city like New Orleans often outlasted ink. A decision made in the silence of a cemetery would soon ripple outward, touching people and places she could not have foreseen. The binding was complete, but the reckoning had only begun. The weeks after the cemetery union revealed the strange contours of a life lived in the shadow of both obligation and rumor. If she had expected quiet, it was not granted. The marriage had closed one ledger, but it opened another, one written not in ink or coin but in reputation, in the slow accumulation of whispers that moved like smoke across the neighborhoods of New Orleans. The daughter of the Voodoo Queen rose each morning to the sounds of a city still alive with its daily rhythms. From her window she heard the clip of mule hooves drawing streetcars along their tracks, the shouts of vendors offering shrimp, oysters, and pralines, the songs of workers making their way toward the docks. The air was thick with the mingled scents of chicory coffee, tobacco smoke, and the river itself, damp, metallic, ever-present. Yet beneath those ordinary fragrances lay the intangible weight of scrutiny. In Tremé, where her family's name had been etched into memory for decades, the people spoke of her choice with a mixture of reverence and suspicion. Some declared that she had acted wisely, preventing the ruin of her household by meeting the creditor's demand. Others whispered that she had dishonored her mother's legacy, that the Queen herself would never have bent so far. Among women at market stalls and men seated outside barbershops, the debates wound endlessly, each opinion sharpening the contours of her reputation. She felt the effects most keenly in the small details of her days. A seamstress who once offered her fabrics on credit now asked for full payment in advance. A neighbor, once quick to share bread or sugar, hesitated at the door before extending her hand. In gatherings where she had once been welcomed with ease, she now sensed a pause in conversation when she entered, a subtle shifting of glances. And yet, not all responses were harsh. Among the younger women of her circle, there was a quiet admiration. They saw in her act a strength, a refusal to let men, whether creditors or suitors, dictate the survival of her household. Some confided to her in whispers, asking how she endured the weight of a vow to a man who could never speak, never touch, never walk beside her. To them, she was not a scandal but a symbol, proof that a woman could navigate impossible choices and still stand. Meanwhile, the creditor's family made no effort to hide their satisfaction. They spoke proudly of their son's completed union, telling their acquaintances that honor had been restored. At their gatherings, they recounted the ceremony as though it had been a triumph rather than a compromise, omitting the plainness of the gown, the silence of the witnesses, and the absence of celebration. For them, it was a story polished to shine in retelling, useful for securing the respect of peers and the stability of future alliances. The city itself, restless, layered, and always shifting, carried the tale along its avenues and alleyways. In the French Quarter, among the tourists and shopkeepers, the story became embellished, transformed into something more dramatic with each retelling. In the Garden District, the wealthy spoke of it with a mixture of disbelief and derision, shaking their heads over what they called old-world customs that had no place in modern society. In Storyville, where music and vice mingled in dim-lit rooms, the tale became part of the colorful chatter exchanged between songs and drinks, half believed, half mocked. But beyond gossip and judgment, there were practical consequences. A woman tied by record to the dead was seen differently in matters of inheritance and property. Potential suitors hesitated, uncertain how such a marriage would affect their own claims. Employers looked at her with doubt, fearing entanglements that might complicate wages or contracts. Even the notary, who had recorded the union with the precision of his profession, now spoke cautiously when asked about it, refusing to confirm details but never denying that the parchment existed. Despite these burdens, she endured. Her daily labor continued, sewing garments, cooking meals, tending to those who sought her guidance in matters of health or fortune. She moved with a quiet determination, refusing to let the stares or whispers unseat her. In the evenings, she sat by the lamplight with her work, the steady rhythm of needle and thread grounding her as the city hummed beyond her walls. Yet she could not escape the knowledge that her story had become part of the city's fabric. New Orleans was a place where memory clung like moss to stone, where stories outlived those who lived them. Her name, once tied only to her mother's, now carried its own shadow, the woman who married the dead to settle a debt. And beneath it all, a question pressed silently. Had the union freed her, or had it bound her more tightly than before? The answer, she sensed, would not come quickly. It would unfold in time, carried by the choices she would yet make, by the reactions of those around her, and by the way history itself chose to remember. For now, the debt was closed. But the story, her story, had only begun to deepen its roots. Autumn 1910 unfolded slowly, with humid afternoons giving way to evenings cooled by breezes drifting from the river. The city of New Orleans pulsed with its rhythms, jazz spilling from Storyville saloons, stevedores shouting at the wharves, women balancing baskets of produce in the markets. Yet behind those familiar sounds, she moved through her days with the weight of a new name, not the name of a bride bound to a living husband, but that of a woman joined to silence. The marriage record, stored among the notary's files, became a curious kind of anchor. Though most of the city would never see the parchment, its existence altered the shape of her life. She could feel it whenever she negotiated, whether for cloth, for rent, or for favors owed. Men who once sought her hand in courtship now regarded her as unavailable, her status made ambiguous by the union. Women who might have welcomed her into their households as a sister or companion held back, unsure of what role to assign her. The record was not just ink. It was a shadow that stretched outward, touching every transaction and interaction. Her mother's legacy complicated matters further. The name of the Voodoo Queen was never far from people's lips, invoked in both reverence and reproach. Some said the daughter's strange union was proof of the mother's lingering power, that even in death the Queen had entangled her family in obligations others could not imagine. Others whispered that it was a mark of weakness, a fall from the command her mother once held. The daughter bore both interpretations in silence, knowing that either could be used against her depending on who spoke them. Still, she did not withdraw. Each morning she walked the streets as she always had, passing the musicians who played on corners, the washerwomen bent over tubs, the children darting through alleys. She greeted neighbors, even those whose replies were clipped or hesitant. She kept her small household intact, cooking meals of beans, rice, and stewed meats when she could afford them. She sewed garments for those who could pay, and sometimes for those who could not, knowing that a favor granted today might be repaid in some unexpected form tomorrow. It was in these small acts of persistence that she carved out a kind of survival. The creditors no longer pressed her, for the family who had demanded the union declared their honor satisfied. That relief was not insignificant. The constant fear of eviction, of being dragged into court, of having her possessions seized, these threats had receded. Yet in their place stood a different kind of scrutiny, the knowledge that she was a woman set apart, her choices subject to judgment from every corner of the city. The whispers followed her into the markets. She would stand before a stall, examining vegetables or cuts of meat, and hear the faint murmur of women behind her. Sometimes it was her name, spoken softly. Sometimes it was only laughter, punctuated with glances. In church, she felt the weight of gazes when she knelt in prayer, though no words were spoken. On the streets, she saw children pointing, repeating fragments they had overheard from their parents. Yet there were also those who sought her out deliberately. A seamstress, younger and less established, came to her asking for advice on how to manage debts without being trapped. A dock worker's wife arrived with questions about how to endure the humiliation of her husband's failures. A midwife, respected in her own right, whispered that she admired the daughter's endurance, that few women could have borne such a burden and continued to walk with their head unbowed. In these moments, she sensed that her story, however distorted, carried a kind of strength that others recognized even if they did not voice it publicly. The city itself seemed to mirror her dual existence, vibrant yet shadowed, ordinary yet extraordinary. The French market bustled with traders from dawn to dusk, while just blocks away, Congo Square remained a place of gathering, memory, and quiet power. Storyville thrived with its music and vice, drawing both fascination and condemnation. Above-ground tombs in the cemeteries gleamed white in the sunlight, silent witnesses to lives that had ended yet continued to shape the living. Amid this backdrop, she carried herself steadily. She visited her mother's grave when she could, leaving small offerings of flowers or bread. Standing before the tomb, she sometimes wondered whether her mother would have approved of the path she had taken, or whether she would have found another way to resolve the debt. The stone did not answer, but the act of standing there reminded her that she was part of a lineage larger than her own doubts. One evening, as the air thickened with the scent of rain, she sat at her table with her sewing, the lamplight casting shadows across the walls. Outside, the city carried on, carriages rattling, laughter drifting from taverns, voices rising in argument and song. She felt the weight of her solitude, but also the strength of her survival. The marriage had not destroyed her. It had marked her, reshaped her, and set her apart, but she remained. The question of what future awaited her lingered, unresolved. She could not remarry in the eyes of many, yet she could not remain untouched by the needs of life: companionship, livelihood, security. How the city would allow her to move forward was uncertain. For now she stitched her seams, lit her lamp, and endured the gaze of a world that did not know what to make of her. The union to the dead had freed her from one form of bondage, only to bind her to another, less visible but no less real. And in the shadows of New Orleans, her name began to settle into legend, whispered not just as the daughter of the Voodoo Queen, but as the woman who had married silence itself. By the start of 1911, the daughter's name had spread beyond the neighborhoods where she lived and worked. Her story traveled on the lips of dockworkers carrying cotton along the levees, on the tongues of musicians playing cornet and trombone in Storyville, in the whispers of washerwomen scrubbing clothes at the river's edge. Some accounts painted her as pitiable, others as admirable, but all agreed that she was no longer just another woman of the city. She had become a symbol, though what she symbolized depended on who was speaking. The newspapers of New Orleans did not print her marriage. Editors preferred stories of political intrigue, crime on the wharves, or the rise of new theaters and saloons. Yet columnists and humorists, eager for anecdotes that drew readers' eyes, hinted at a widow whose groom never lived to see his vows, or a bride who found herself wedded to silence. These pieces never mentioned her name directly, but those familiar with the markets and the streets knew who was being described. In this way, her life seeped into the public imagination without the formality of ink. The city's divisions shaped how her story was received. In Tremé, some elders invoked her choice when warning the young about the dangers of debt, telling them, "Do not let promises bind your children as they bound hers." Others, especially women, spoke of her resilience, admiring her ability to endure humiliation rather than collapse beneath it. In the French Quarter, the tale was told with a note of scandal, proof to some that the old traditions of the city were relics best left behind. Uptown families used the story as a cautionary tale about the dangers of entangling with those they considered beneath them. Meanwhile, she lived quietly but firmly, refusing to vanish from the public eye. She continued her work as a seamstress, her small home filled with bolts of fabric, spools of thread, and garments in various stages of completion. She took in commissions from neighbors and occasionally from wealthier patrons who had heard of her skill, though some arrived with hesitation, uncertain whether it was proper to employ a woman with such a reputation. She met them with dignity, never apologizing for her past, never offering explanations unless directly asked. The children of the neighborhood, less restrained by adult caution, sometimes followed her in the street, calling out names they had overheard. "Bride of the tomb," they whispered, half in mockery, half in awe. She did not chase them away, nor did she encourage them. She walked with steady steps, her silence answering their taunts more sharply than words could have. Over time, even the children grew accustomed to her presence, no longer startled by the unusual shape of her story. Her household remained modest, but she managed to keep it intact. A few relatives came and went, drawn by need, and she offered them shelter when she could. She taught younger women to sew, sharing skills that might provide them with a living. In this way, her small home became more than just a place of work. It became a gathering space, a quiet refuge for those who lived on the edge of the city's economy. Yet the marriage's shadow lingered in matters of law and property. The notary's record of her union to the deceased remained in the family's possession, and though the creditor declared the debt settled, the paper could be summoned whenever disputes arose. More than once, she found herself approached by clerks or lawyers asking questions about her status. Was she free to contract on her own, or did her vows to the deceased bind her in ways not yet tested in court? Each inquiry reminded her that she was never fully beyond the reach of the tomb. The cemeteries themselves took on a deeper presence in her life. She visited often, sometimes to tend her mother's grave, sometimes to stand before the tomb where her vows had been spoken. She did not linger long, nor did she bring elaborate offerings, but her footsteps traced the paths between the whitewashed walls, her figure a familiar sight to the groundskeepers. To them, she was simply another mourner, yet those who recognized her sometimes stopped in their own prayers to watch, as though hoping to glimpse in her face some sign of what it meant to be wed to the dead. Her endurance became a kind of quiet power. While others might have fled the city or hidden themselves in shame, she continued to walk openly, her head held level. That stubborn visibility gave her a strange authority. People came to her with questions not only about sewing or debts, but about endurance itself. How to withstand humiliation, how to continue when choices were stripped away. She never claimed wisdom, but her very presence suggested that survival was possible even under the weight of ridicule and rumor. As Mardi Gras approached that year, parades filled the streets, floats rolled through the quarter, and costumed revelers danced until dawn. She did not join the festivities, but her story became part of them nonetheless. Maskers donned costumes of brides and grooms, some mocking, some playful, and among the jesting was always at least one whispered mention of the woman who married the silent groom. She stayed home during those nights, listening to the music and laughter spill into the streets, aware that her name traveled among the revelers even as she remained unseen. In these months, she came to realize that her life had been reshaped in ways beyond her control. She had entered the union to settle a debt, expecting only relief from financial ruin. Instead, she had become a figure of legend within her own lifetime, her actions repeated, reshaped, and retold by a city that thrived on story. And so she moved through her days, sewing, cooking, visiting the graves, speaking quietly with those who came to her door, while above it all the legend of her life grew taller than the woman herself. The marriage to the dead had freed her from one obligation, but it had bound her forever to the imagination of New Orleans. The second year after the cemetery ceremony brought a slow but unmistakable change. The story of the daughter of the Voodoo Queen and her marriage to the dead no longer belonged only to her neighbors. It began to seep into the broader fabric of New Orleans life, traveling into circles of law, commerce, and even the arts. The tale became something more than an oddity. It became a touchstone for conversations about tradition, debt, honor, and the boundaries between the living and the dead. In the legal offices along Royal and Canal Streets, clerks and attorneys debated the implications of the union. Some dismissed it as nothing more than a family arrangement, with no standing under Louisiana's civil code. Others argued that precedent existed, pointing to French cases of mariage posthume or the rare contracts that recognized vows made even after death. A few speculated that the union might complicate inheritance laws. Could the deceased's estate, however modest, be claimed by his bride? Could she be considered his widow in matters of property? No court had yet ruled on these questions, but the possibility hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. Among merchants, the story carried a different kind of weight. Creditors who once thought debts could be pressed without limit began to consider the risks of pushing too far. To force a woman into such an arrangement was, to some, an act of power. To others, it bordered on cruelty that might tarnish reputations. The daughter herself had gained a strange form of leverage. Though mocked in some corners, she was feared in others, for her endurance suggested a resilience not easily bent by pressure. Merchants eyed her with caution, uncertain whether engaging her would bring stability or entangle them in a story too heavy to bear. Meanwhile, in the artistic quarters of the French Quarter, her story took on a life of its own. Poets scribbled verses that hinted at her fate, couched in imagery of roses placed on marble, of brides without grooms. Painters sketched women standing before tombs, their figures blurred into shadows. Musicians wove fragments of her tale into their lyrics, sometimes sorrowful, sometimes playful. The city, hungry always for stories, found in her life a source of endless inspiration. She herself did not seek this attention. Her days remained practical, focused on the work of survival. She rose early, prepared simple meals, tended to her sewing, and welcomed those who came to her door for advice or comfort. She was neither recluse nor performer. She did not chase the stories told about her, nor did she correct them. Instead, she lived steadily within the quiet walls of her home, allowing the world to interpret her as it wished. Yet she could not ignore the way her life had been reshaped. Invitations to social gatherings diminished. Suitors did not call. Neighbors who once spoke freely now measured their words. Even kin treated her differently, some offering respect laced with distance, others keeping their visits brief. The union had granted her freedom from financial ruin, but it had also placed her outside the circle of ordinary womanhood. She was neither maiden nor wife in the conventional sense, and that ambiguity unsettled those who measured life by clear categories. Still, she carved out her own space of authority. Younger women sought her counsel, seeing in her a figure who had endured what others could not. They asked her how to manage debts, how to refuse suitors who came with more menace than promise, how to preserve dignity in a world quick to judge. She did not claim wisdom, but she spoke plainly of her choices and their costs. Her words carried weight precisely because they were grounded in lived experience, not abstract advice. The cemeteries, once places of solemn dread for many, became for her a familiar landscape. She walked their paths not as a stranger, but as one bound by vow. Groundskeepers recognized her footsteps, nodding as she passed. Visitors sometimes paused, whispering her name when they realized who she was. The tomb of her groom remained unmarked by flowers except for those she placed, simple tokens, never elaborate, but consistent. In these visits she found a strange kind of peace, as though acknowledging the union that had both burdened and freed her. Beyond the city, travelers carried her story outward. Riverboat passengers spoke of the woman who had married the dead. Journalists from other states, hearing rumors, came to New Orleans seeking details, though few found her willing to speak. What they wrote was often colored by exaggeration, transforming her into a figure of superstition or scandal. Still, the effect was the same. Her name became part of the lore of Louisiana, recounted in towns far beyond the reach of the Mississippi. Within her own heart, questions lingered. She had survived humiliation, but had she gained freedom? The debt was closed, but had she simply exchanged one form of bondage for another, bound now to a memory, to a record, to a role she had not chosen? She did not voice these doubts aloud, but they shadowed her quiet evenings, when the lamp flickered against the walls and the city's music drifted faintly through her window. She endured, as she always had. She sewed, she cooked, she walked the markets, she visited the graves. Yet the longer she lived with her unusual status, the more she understood that her life was no longer solely her own. It belonged also to the city that gossiped, judged, admired, and reshaped her story. She was living not only as a woman, but as a legend in the making, a role she had not sought but could not refuse. By 1912, the daughter of the Voodoo Queen had lived nearly 2 years under the shadow of her cemetery vows. In that time, her life had become a quiet study in endurance. Her household remained modest, her income uncertain, yet she kept herself afloat with needle, thread, and determination. Though her circumstances had not improved greatly in material terms, she had gained a kind of unshakable presence in the city's imagination. The legend of her marriage continued to ripple outward, sometimes reshaped into forms she scarcely recognized. In taverns, men retold it as a cautionary tale about the danger of debt, their voices thick with drink and exaggeration. In parlors, women whispered of her as a figure of scandal, warning daughters to avoid such entanglements. Among musicians, her story provided verses to ballads that blended sorrow with rhythm, sung in smoky rooms where patrons swayed to the sound of brass. Her name, spoken in these contexts, was no longer her own alone. It had become a vessel into which others poured their fears, judgments, and fascinations. Yet she carried on, refusing to retreat. The city's cemeteries, with their high walls, whitewashed tombs, and marble angels, became even more central to her life. She walked their paths with the familiarity of one who belonged, not only as a mourner, but as a bride bound by parchment and ritual. Visitors sometimes stopped to watch her, their curiosity piqued by the sight of a living woman tending a union with the dead. Some whispered prayers as she passed, others shook their heads, muttering about curses or shame. She accepted both reactions in silence. At times, she wondered how the notary's record might one day be used against her. The paper, carefully inscribed with her name beside the deceased's, had already drawn the attention of clerks and lawyers curious about its implications. If property changed hands, if inheritance was contested, her unusual status could become a weapon in disputes not yet imagined. The knowledge unsettled her, yet there was nothing she could do. The record existed, and so did the whispers, both beyond her control. Despite the weight of her story, she remained a source of counsel for others. Younger women, facing their own struggles with debts or unwanted advances, came to her for advice. She spoke not in riddles or mysteries, but in plain truths. Survival required hard choices. Dignity could be preserved even under judgment, and strength lay in endurance as much as in defiance. Her words carried authority because they were grounded in her lived reality, not in abstract ideals. Children, once cruel in their mockery, grew accustomed to her presence. They no longer shouted names when she walked past. Instead, some followed her quietly, curious about the woman who bore a legend on her shoulders. A few even came to her door, offering errands or small tasks in exchange for coins. She accepted them, turning their mischief into usefulness. In this way, she softened the edges of her reputation, at least in the eyes of the young. As for suitors, they remained absent. The ambiguity of her status, neither widow nor maiden in the conventional sense, placed her outside the boundaries of traditional courtship. Some men may have felt curiosity, but none risked their reputations to pursue her openly. She accepted this reality with quiet resignation. Companionship, though longed for, was not hers to claim. Still, Her resilience gave her a quiet power. She had faced a demand few could have borne, and she had met it without collapse. That fact alone commanded respect among those who looked closely enough to see it. Her survival, day by day, became an act of defiance against the weight of ridicule and rumor. The city around her changed as well. Jazz spread beyond Storyville, its rhythms reaching into parades and street corners. Automobiles began to appear alongside horse-drawn carriages, their engines rattling over cobblestones. The old and the new coexisted uneasily, just as her life straddled the line between tradition and modernity. One evening, as she walked home from market with a basket of bread and beans, she passed a group of strangers gathered near the gates of St. Louis Cemetery. They were tourists, guided by a local who pointed to tombs and recounted stories of the city's dead. When he gestured toward her, lowering his voice as if in reverence, she realized with a jolt that she herself had become part of the tour. Her presence was noted as though she were a living relic, her life folded into the lore recited for outsiders' fascination. She did not stop to listen. She kept walking, her steps steady, her face unreadable. But inside, she felt the weight of recognition. Her story no longer belonged only to her city. It had become part of how New Orleans was seen by the world beyond its borders. That night, she sat in the glow of her lamp, the sounds of music drifting faintly from the quarter. She considered the strange arc of her life, born into the shadow of a famous mother, pressed into a union with the dead, transformed into a story told by strangers. She had not chosen this path, yet she had walked it with as much dignity as she could muster. The marriage had begun as a transaction, a settlement of debt. But over time, it had become something else, a mirror held up to the city, reflecting its traditions, its cruelties, its fascination with the boundary between the living and the dead. And she, whether she wished it or not, had become the face in that mirror. Her life was no longer measured only by her own actions. It was measured also by the stories told about her, stories that would continue long after she herself had been laid to rest. The legend of the bride of the tomb had grown beyond her control, yet she endured, walking each day with the steady grace of one who understood that survival itself could be a kind of victory. By the middle of the 1910s, the daughter of the Voodoo Queen lived with the full weight of what her life had become. Nearly every corner of New Orleans carried some echo of her story. It passed from the mouths of market sellers haggling over fish and sugarcane. It traveled in the smoky bars where jazz bands stretched their notes until dawn. It even reached the parlors of the wealthy, where it was whispered as both scandal and curiosity. She had been transformed from a woman settling a private debt into a figure inseparable from the city's identity. The years had marked her. Her hair, once dark and unbroken, bore streaks of silver. Her hands, calloused from endless hours of sewing, showed the labor of survival. Yet her bearing remained the same, steady, upright, unyielding. She had long accepted that suitors would not come, that her home would not be filled with children of her own. Instead, she poured herself into the lives of nieces, nephews, and the children of neighbors. She mended their clothes, offered counsel when asked, and gave them small tokens of comfort in a city that often demanded too much of the young. The cemeteries remained her constant. She visited often, not only to honor the vows written in ink and stone, but because the quiet among the tombs gave her space to think. She knew that the city around her was changing. Automobiles multiplied, electricity reached into more homes, new buildings rose along Canal Street, yet the cemeteries remained still, their marble faces unchanging. In them, she found continuity, a reminder that her story was only one thread in the larger weave of lives that had come and gone before her. By then, her name had traveled far beyond Louisiana. Travelers carried her story northward along the Mississippi, to Memphis, St. Louis, and Chicago. Writers and journalists, eager for material, placed her tale in newspapers and magazines, though often stripped of context or bent toward sensationalism. In their accounts, she became either a tragic heroine or a figure of superstition, depending on the needs of the story. The real woman, living quietly with her needle and cloth, was rarely recognized in those accounts, but she no longer expected to be. The legal implications of her union never fully vanished. Lawyers occasionally resurrected her case in debates about marriage and property. Some cited her marriage as evidence of Louisiana's unusual traditions, proof that the old codes of France and Spain still lingered in practice. Others dismissed it as an anomaly, a curiosity without weight. To her, it was neither. It was simply her life, lived under the shadow of a paper she had signed, a choice made to preserve her family's survival. As time passed, she began to understand that her survival had given her a quiet kind of authority. People who once mocked her now approached her with respect. Younger women continued to come for advice, but now even men sometimes sought her counsel, asking how to manage obligations or how to withstand the judgment of others. She did not claim to be a teacher, yet she spoke with the gravity of someone who had endured what few could imagine. Her presence alone reminded others that it was possible to live under the heaviest of burdens and still remain upright. The city around her never forgot the spectacle of her vows. Mardi Gras crews continued to reference her in floats and costumes, blending her story into the pageantry of the season. Tour guides wove her name into their cemetery routes, pointing to the tomb as though it were as much a monument as the marble itself. Musicians sang verses that hinted at her life, transforming her endurance into song. She had become part of the fabric of New Orleans, her personal story absorbed into the collective memory of the place. In her later years, she carried herself with the calm of someone who had come to terms with her fate. The shame others had tried to place upon her no longer stung. The ridicule of children had long since faded. The isolation of her middle years had softened into quiet companionship with neighbors and kin who respected her endurance. She had not chosen her path, but she had walked it without bending. When she passed, the exact year lost among the city's countless records, her funeral drew more than family. Neighbors, former apprentices, and even strangers who had only heard the stories came to pay their respects. She was laid to rest not far from the tomb where she had spoken her vows decades earlier. For some, it seemed fitting. The circle closed, the bride of the tomb resting now among the very dead with whom her life had been bound. Her memory lingered. Generations repeated her story, reshaping it with each telling. Some emphasized her suffering, others her strength. Some cast her as a figure of superstition, others as a woman who had endured the cruelty of debt with dignity. No single version prevailed, but all agreed that her name belonged to the city's lore. And so, the life of the daughter of the Voodoo Queen ended as it had been lived, bound not only to her own choices, but to the stories others told. She had been a woman of flesh and blood, a worker of needle and thread, yet her existence had become inseparable from the imagination of New Orleans. In marrying the dead to settle a debt, she had secured more than her family's survival. She had secured her place in history, written not in ink alone, but in the memory of a city that thrives on stories. And so her vows echoed far beyond the grave, leaving a story that still lingers in the streets of New Orleans. If you want more stories etched in shadow and memory, subscribe now to Eternal Obsidian, where history's darkest corners come alive.